A little bit this afternoon. They chose me, asked me to come out and help this afternoon. I didn't think I'd really be doing any talking. That made me telling some old jokes that nobody really wanted to hear anyway. But what I'd like to do is fill in and give you some of what Pete had put together. We're standing on Landrum House Ridge. It's a slight ridge, and coming up the lane, part of the historic lane, the house site right out here. This is really kind of no man's land as far as the Union Confederates are concerned. As far as from May 8th all the way through the end of the battle. Because right across the field over there, along that ridge line, is the Muleshoe, the salient. The big point is occupied Edward Johnson and his division. But that's not the main, that's the main line. There is an advanced line right where we're standing. All through the woods here, this is the picket line for Johnson's division. Out here on the morning, actually overnight of May 11th, in the morning of May 12th, the primary men of Witcher's Virginia Brigade. This is John Jones' brigade that fought so well in the wilderness. General Jones was killed in the wilderness. Colonel Thomas Witcher is now commanding the brigade, and they've been given the perfect position right up there, right in the very apex of the Muleshoe. Those lucky Virginians, right in the very point. And as a result, they are also responsible for this part of the picket line that extends along this ridge and through the woods. In 1864, it's wooded very much like it is today. We do know that these trees to my left were not here. It was more open, it was pushed back a little bit farther, from 50 to 75, some more feet. But out here, that tree line is basically where it was in 1864. The trees were fairly thin at that time, because no more than maybe 30, 40, 50 yards on the other side is the Brown Farm. The Brown Farm is just about, I believe, a quarter of a mile in that direction. The Brown Farm is where Hancock will form up the 2nd Army Corps on the evening of May 11th, morning of May 12th, for this assault here on the Bloody Angle on the morning of May 12th, which will occur right around 4:30 in the morning. To give you an idea of what's going on out here, though, Johnson's men, as you well know, you've probably heard the story, are now back in the Muleshoe. They've been warned to stay alert, stay awake all night, because they can hear this constant rumbling of wagons and even footpaths, men moving from left to right. Lee believes that this is Grant's withdrawal. He's pulling down towards the courthouse road, possibly to turn left to go back to Fredericksburg and across the Rappahannock River, or he's trying to turn Lee's right. To protect himself, he pulls out the artillery battalion, about 22 guns up here, under Major R.C.M. Page. Major Page's guns are stacked all along the point of the apex. The apex of the Muleshoe itself is important because that is where they feel the real weak part of it's going to be. Upton had his success on Dole's Salient on the western part of the Muleshoe on May 10th, but Lee still believes if Johnson holds his position with his troops and his artillery, that should be adequate to stop any sort of infantry assault in that position. Why? Let's go back to May 10th. It wasn't just Upton making his attack against the Muleshoe. He had a division in support under Gresham Mott from the 2nd Army Corps. Mott's division is a compilation of a number of regiments that served in the old 3rd Army Corps, which were all means was virtually destroyed at the Battle of Gettysburg. It was combined into one division. Part of it was sent into another division, now part of the 2nd Army Corps, which also suffered somewhat of the same fate during the Gettysburg campaign and again in the fall of '63 in the campaigns in Northern Virginia and Mine Run. The 2nd Army Corps now is a conglomerate corps. It's men of the 2nd Corps and men of the old 3rd Corps. Mott's division is one of those old 3rd Corps divisions. Men packed together. Some of the regiments now are reduced down to the size of battalions, about 150, maybe 200 men. But Mott's support of Upton is going to occur right here where we're standing. He's not going to go in beside Upton or behind him. He's going to come in way over here. Some of it's misdirection by staff officers, and a lot of it is just the failure in communications. As we all know, if we study military, nothing goes off as planned. And on May 10th, it's a perfect example. There's a lot of mix-ups as far as Army Command is concerned. Mott believes he's supposed to go in about 5 o'clock. He doesn't get the word that Upton's been delayed till 6. At 5 o'clock, he's been step out of the woods, and they are stopped cold right about where this lane is. They don't get more than 20 to 30 paces beyond this woods before Page's guns open up on them and Johnson's infantry opens on them and throws them back very handily. Mott's men fell back in disorder. They reformed in the Brown Farm, and as the big earthworks lit farther down. But that sets the stage really for what's going to happen on the morning of May 12th. And let's talk very briefly about this man, Edward Johnson, because he's the one who's really worried about what's going on out here. Lee is worried, as are other people, but it's really Johnson, because he's responsible for this part of the battle line. He's responsible for the field. And on the evening May 11th, Lee takes all of his artillery away. Page's entire battalion is withdrawn and moved over to the courthouse to protect that flank, or to be used as basically flying artillery in case Grant does try another maneuver around the right to strike towards the courthouse crossroads. So Johnson now has no guns. And he's really worried. He tells his men, stay alert, stay awake, all night long, stay alert, stay awake. And for the most part, the men do so. One odd thing about Johnson, though, he's a native-born Virginian. He's a really good, solid officer. He served under Jackson, was wounded at McDowell in 1862, and his leg never really fully recovered. So for thereafter, every time he was off a horse, he used a long walking pole to get around. I know at Culp's Hill, at Gettysburg, he's often seen in the woods there using this pole to walk around and steady himself as he's trying to direct and give orders. And the men started to call him Cump Johnson. Not a very nice name, but that's what they started to call him, kind of as a nickname. But here, overnight, May 11th, May 12th, he's behind the line with this long pole, leaning against a tree, leaning against that pole, trying to get around to direct his division. The other odd thing about him, he had this crazy habit of blinking a lot. And when he was recovering down in Richmond, he went to a lot of the parties, the social events down there, and the ladies just loved him. He was a real talker. He loved the ladies. He'd be sitting over in the corner talking to these ladies, kind of blinking. All the men would get anxious and then jealous because, well, he's blinking at my wife. He was a good officer and really kind of quite a character. But Johnson is severely worried about what's going on out here. The two regiments that are out here from Witcher's Brigade are the 21st Virginia and the 42nd Virginia. The 21st is manning the picket line just about all along the east face of this salient, through the woods here along the ridge and around towards the east, down towards where the 9th Corps is eventually going to come in. The 48th, rather, is just beyond us, behind here in the woods, in pits dug throughout the woods, stretching around the apex of the salient. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, the 48th Virginia, under Colonel Witcher, is going to come out and relieve these men. While those soldiers back in the line have stayed fairly alert all night, these pickets out here have had a real tough time. I can only imagine the sergeant of the guard, his duty, going from picket to picket, trying to keep these men awake. They have been in constant motion, constant combat, with poor food, no time to rest, no time to wash, ever since May 4th. Constantly, and they are exhausted. The human body just can only manage so much. Here they are in the dark. It started to rain. They have no rain cover. Many of them are so exhausted they just fall asleep where they lay in their trenches. About 4:30 in the morning, though, they're going to have a rude awakening. Hancock's orders are to attack right at 4 o'clock, but he delays because of so much fog and so much smog out here. They can't really see where the Confederate line is. They can't see the Confederate defensive works. He delays a half hour. Throughout the night, though, some of these pickets report back. We can hear troops in our front, hear movement in our front. Johnson's alarmed. He's able to get the artillery back. The artillery arrives back in the mule shoe right at about 4:30. We'll talk about them when we finally get to the mule shoe. Out here, the pickets are fast asleep. The 48th Virginia is just forming up, taking roll call, getting ready to come out of the works, come out to relieve these men, when every Yankee in the world comes pouring out of these trees, running right over those skirmishers and those pickets out here. Those men never had a chance. Charles Wagant of the 124th New York remembered that any of these pickets must have been sleeping, but notwithstanding the noise made by the snapping of dry twigs as we passed over them and the rattle of brush as we were forcing our way through it, they evidently had not the slightest intimation of our approach until we were close upon them, when they hurriedly discharged their pieces and fled to give warning to the troops of the main body. A lot of them never even had that chance. Never had that chance. You've heard the stories about the wetness that night that wet the powder of those men up in the angle. It was the same for many of the pickets out here. They did not even have a chance to fire a shot. All they could do was turn their rifles up or throw their arms up and surrender. Remember, the 66th New York remembered, just as his division, Barlow's division, the 1st Division, to cross over the fields just to the east of us, and down there to hit the eastern slate of the angle, eastern part of the mule shoe. He remembered double quick, with a mad rush our boys were upon them, and a dull thud here and there as the butt of a musket compelled a more speedy surrender, and told how well the order has been obeyed. In other words, the pickets were just overrun. Not a single one was able to escape. Not a single one. From this point on, this is going to be in Union control. But the issue is really going to now switch to the mule shoe and the angle. Okay. I heard it was one of the
That was the last Mason class. We argued with him. As you would expect him to. But I said, just to look at him, he's so harsh. Putting out Ethan's hand, dabbling with the cornfield.
So you're probably looking at a P51 or P24.
You when you tap it.
Yeah.
And it's a very small, innocuous little one-story structure. It wasn't much to it at all. And it was abandoned at the time of the fighting here because it was right between the battle lines. There had been some skirmishing out here on May 11th, very light, but it's on May 12th is when everything falls together all here. Barlow's division, the 1st Division of the 2nd Army Corps, is the division that's going to pass right through here. Approximately 8,500 officers and men. In the first line is the 4th Brigade under Colonel John Rudder Brooke. You mentioned earlier about Emory Upton being a colonel, commanding a brigade for over a year. Brooke was the same way. He was a colonel, commanded the brigade for almost 2 years before he finally received promotion. Brooke wasn't lucky enough to think of an attack like Upton did here, so Brooke was colonel for a lot longer. But Brooke's line passed just about where we passed over, and his line is the first one to go into the angle itself, right at the very apex, just up there on this tall side of the ridge. What really protected them, though, once they came through the woods, and there was a scattering of shots at first, just some small rifle shots. But going down here into this valley, into this small run, and up that slope protected them very briefly. It's when they got up to the top, that's when all hell broke loose. That's when Johnson's men then tried to open up on the line as they came in. It was a huge mass formation. As one Confederate soldier put it, they came on in what looked like to him great disorder. The front line looked disordered, but this line stretched back as far as I could see. And that is because these divisions were massed together in solid battle lines and closed formation, almost like a large fist. And that large fist, the 2nd Army Corps, is going to punch right through there. Francis Barlow, some of you may remember him, you should remember him. He started out as the colonel of the 61st New York Volunteer Infantry, severely wounded just about every battle he was in, including Gettysburg, where he almost died. He was able to return to the Army in 1864, and now he's in command of the 1st Division of the 2nd Corps. He's fairly new to this division. He doesn't really know them very well, except for his old regiment, and they really don't know him very well. What they find out fairly quickly is he has a very strict discipline. Plus, discipline is number one. If you mouth off to him, if you backsass him, look out. You're going to get the blade of his sword right across your back.
I actually, I do 2nd Delaware Infantry as a reenactor, and I'm a researcher for them, and I have a diary and letters for Cyrus Forwood of the 2nd Delaware. He actually speaks of Barlow none too highly. I think he refers to him as putting on more airs than any 10 men should. He also, before this campaign, is forcing the soldiers to wear white gloves on dress parade, and the entire regiment of the 2nd Delaware is going basically, we're not doing that. He's also known to forcing them to start putting chevrons back on their uniforms, and really, and they're like, what are you doing? And because their only experience with him was as a colonel.
The most famous episode with him that I can think of offhand, just before the campaign began, he noticed a lot of the line officers, captains, lieutenants, had removed their shoulder boards, and preferred just to go without rank at all because the sharpshooters were after them. That's what the sharpshooters saw. He passed out an order just prior to the campaign that every officer should have those shoulder boards on. That insignia of rank was really important. Some officers got around that by buying the smaller little bars to pin to their collars, just like the modern Army today. But he didn't like that either. If he saw somebody with these small bars in his collar, he told them to get the shoulder boards on, or he'd have them disciplined or court-martialed. Nice guy. Nice guy. Everyone liked him. He was real friendly. But he was a really good leader, and I feel bad for him here on May 11th, May 12th, because overnight his division marches almost all the way from the Po River behind the entire Army position to get into position here and form on the Brown Farm for this attack. The staff officers who were guiding his division here did not have a lot of information. All they were told was where to take the division to. They weren't told, tell the general what he needs to know. And Barlow corners one of these poor staff officers, either a captain or a lieutenant, and asks him, where is the enemy? Where's the enemy line? The officer says, I'm not sure, General, I think it's over here. He says, what does the enemy line look like? And he says, I really don't know, I haven't seen it, but I know it's over there. What's the strength like? He couldn't answer that. Barlow, in frustration, says, well, God's sakes, point us in the right direction so I don't have to march all the way around the world to come up in their rear. That's something about the frustration that night. And Barlow wasn't the only one frustrated by this. A lot of the colonels and major to lieutenant colonels in charge of regiments now were ordered to form their line in these tight block formations. This isn't the traditional way that you fight a Civil War battle, tactics-wise. You don't go into battle like that. There's a lot of frustration, not just on the general level, running down through the ranks. It's Hancock himself, who rides along the line about 3:30 or 4 o'clock just before the assault begins, that tries to calm things down and tell them, boys, got a job ahead of you, stay calm, stay quiet, keep your rifles loaded, bayonets fixed, mind your officers. And whatever you hear, it's the same word that Upton ordered his men, forward, forward, forward. Do not stop for anybody. And at 4:35, Barlow's division crashes out of these woods down to this valley, and Brooks' brigade, the 4th Brigade, is one of the first ones into the works itself. And what happens up there at the works is probably easier for to talk about up there. What happens back here at the Landrum House, though, during that fighting throughout May 12th and into the morning of May 13th, this is basically command central for the 2nd Corps. Hancock will use the house as his headquarters. All of the messages coming back, all the ammunition that is brought up to the 2nd Corps troops comes right through this spot here. Because of the nature of the fighting, there's so much lead and iron flying through the air, they can't bring up supply wagons. They strap the boxes of ammunition to mules and bring mules up down into this small valley down here where they unstrap the boxes, and from there they load the ammunition into shelter halves, gum blankets, or carry the boxes up as best they can up to the men in the front line to reload their ammunition, to reload their boxes. Has anybody ever tried to pick up an actual loaded case of Civil War small arms ammunition, besides me? I've got a rupture to show. It's heavy. It weighs about 85 pounds. It's not an easy thing to carry. So everyone says, well, they could just carry the ammunition right up there. And I've seen drawings, illustrations, these guys walking with them, and just, you can't do that. It's 85 pounds. And to take all that up there through the mud and the firing, everyone's shooting at you, very, very difficult task. But they're able to get ammunition up there in just a solid line from the mule depot down here. I also like to point this area out too. When I was here in 1976, this area was still overgrown. You really couldn't see much down in this valley. But what happened down here too is another thing that we don't often think about. These weapons, during that continual fighting, would foul very rapidly. It's black powder, it's very humid, it's a wet day. The guns would jam up really quickly. They would, in turn, send details of men back, loaded with weapons. They'd come down here, right in this little area by the stream, where they clean these weapons out, get them back in service again, and carry them back up. And that occurred right in this little valley right down here. Any questions or comments so far from anybody else?
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, you said they got the ammunition so far. Then how did they pass it? Just by people passing it up to get more ammunition?
They would
to
load it
people?
into shelter halves, and 2 or 3 men would just carry it up and give it to the men up in front.
And
They
then-
drag it from the boxes. And
Okay, and the guys would just, I mean, because you're all spread out.
Sure.
The folks are. So the guys that ran out of ammunition would try to find somebody that had it.
Went right up to the front. Whoever was up in the front line, we can't think of a regiment being up in the very front along that work all day long, because they were pulled out and relieved. Their ammunition ran out.
Okay, all right, so rolling.
So it was constant movement of troops back up and forth, and where the ammunition was with them. Men carried it up. They found somebody that needed ammunition. They gave it to them right away. It didn't matter what the regiment
Right.
belonged to. Another significant thing that happened back here, and I know Peter wanted to talk about this, was the artillery. Though the Confederate guns were captured, completely put out of order right in the beginning of the action, the problem was the artillery for the Union. How are you going to support this attack? And as May 12th turns out, from about 8 o'clock on, the lines are so close, you cannot put guns back here to actually shell the Confederate works without hitting your own men. They're danger forward. They're so close, you can't do that. They tried Coehorn mortars. 15th New York Heavy Artillery had about 8 Coehorn mortars. They brought here along this ridge where we're standing and began to fire over into the Confederate works that afternoon. The difficulty was the lines were so close together, they really couldn't tell friend from foe. And when the rain really started pouring in periods throughout the afternoon, they had to cease fire because they're loading these with just plain powder, not a powder charge in a bag. You just pour the powder and put the shell on top of it. But eventually they had to stop firing because they were hitting their own men. One of the Confederates, David Holder, was in the 16th Mississippi. His regiment was just the other side of the bloody angle. He later wrote about these mortars hitting the line. Along in the evening, they moved some mortars into position, attempted to drop a few shells into our trench. They either overshot, the shells falling harmlessly in the rear, or else they undershot us, the shells falling among our own men. Once they made a direct hit, there were 2 men just to the right of our flag, sitting with their backs to the breastworks and their feet in the ditch. A shell burst between them. One was blown into the ditch in fragments, and the head of the other was knocked off without moving the body. 24-pound shell is a heck of a charge. It's a heck of a charge. When those things went off, they did a lot of damage, just so they hit right. But if you're on this side, wearing a blue uniform, the last thing you do is want to be laying out there looking up and seeing this mortar shell coming right at you. And finally about, I guess around 5 o'clock or so, they just ceased firing. The mortars just were not having the effect. Darkness was starting to fall. There's still a lot of infantry fighting up at the angle, but the artillery was just absolutely useless out here on May 12th. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Was this plowed ground? Was it pasture? What was the ground like?
I don't remember exactly. Part of it was pasture, but some of it was plowed. These are very small, self-sufficient farms. Landrum, Brown, McCool, all these people, they have maybe a garden, and out there is one small pasture for a cow and a horse, and then the rest of it's maybe planted wheat, oats, rye, maybe a little bit of corn. The ground here is not the most suitable though for crop growing, so there's not a lot of massive fields, but it's a mixture of things. What we don't read about very much though are the amount of fencing that was out here. Every farmer usually fenced their fields, and the fencing disappeared pretty quick. I suspect that some of it actually disappeared long before the battle even started. Some of it was incorporated into the earthworks and the abattis, some of it was just used for firewood, and a lot of it was just destroyed and left behind. That's one thing we're kind of missing here, are all the fence lines that probably subdivided these fields and pastures.
John, was there any, obviously Barlow's division comes sweeping through here. Had the Confederates put I've read where the Confederates had sharpshooters and had people in the Landrum house initially.
This is evidently a skirmish reserve back here for the picket line.
Do you know what unit they threw out as like flanker off of Barlow's? Because I've read where it may have been the 2nd, but I'm not sure.
I don't know. I can't tell you off sure.
Yeah, but all right. So, but there was action here where the Union troops had to sweep through the house here. And
they swept through the house and through the yard and drove what little Confederates were here out of there.
Okay.
Yes.
I got kind of a weird question. Do you know what this very large hole behind the Landrum house is?
That's the secret missile silo.
Was a big tree there that fell over?
I honestly don't know.
Must be recent.
It was an ice house.
The ice house. It was the ice house site.
It was the ice house?
Yeah.
Okay.
If one wanted to walk past the Landrum house, where does it lead?
Where's the trail lead? It's been so long since I've been out here, I don't know. The trail past the Landrum house, where that finally goes to.
It dead ends in the woods. It doesn't really go anywhere.
So, but that's where the bulk of the Second Corps were.
Yes, ma'am. Barlow's division is the left wing of the Second Corps. They come through here. Gibbon's division is right behind them. Over here on the other side is Birney and Mott. And they're passing in the valley to hit the very square part of the angle right there at the very point. Does that make sense, or am I losing you?
No.
I can confuse people very easily. I just make this stuff up. We all raise it.
Except for the missile silo.
I like that better than the
That's real.
Well, ice house is boring stuff.
Secret Civil War missile silo?
It didn't have the fuel yet. That's when I think we're going to take people out here and right across the field. Is everybody willing to go right across the field right to the angle?
Yeah.
Everybody okay? Yep. If you need assistance along the way,
We're going over the branch. The awful branch.
Oh, that's all right. I was still kind of contemplating the other one, but like I said, it's getting mud. You did say we were going to get wet and dirty.
Virginia mud on the boots.
My photographs over there, helped a lot of it. That covered, I couldn't get all the artillery when I got that. But it was beautiful. As you can see.
back down the straw, back to the supply train, helped load a mule, brought the mule back up, dumped the ammo down here in this little valley, loaded the shelter half, and that's how they carried it up. And the man said we did that 5 or 6 times throughout the afternoon and evening hours, which makes sense. The Confederates did the same thing. To get the ammo up there, there's nobody going to bring a supply wagon up and carry that kind of weight. And anybody who showed their face would throw it off the ground with all of it.
Yeah.
So the Confederates did the same thing. They unloaded the ammunition, put it in shelter halves or gum blankets, dragged that to the front, dragged it up here, and then by just doled out whoever needed it. I've read stories of them packing it up in maybe a small piece of cloth and throwing it over the travelers to the next line of work so everybody had ammo. The fighting here would build up to a crescendo and die down. Build up, die down. It was really right here. This is the angle. This is the closest place of contact. From about this point, all the other avenue where it comes in on Harris's line. This is the closest point of contact for that 22 hours. Down here, the Second Corps, they've got troops up on the works, but they've also got most of them concentrated in this valley that slopes down to the valley. Okay. The Confederates not in the works themselves, but back in the woods, anywhere from 30 to 40 to maybe 100 feet. And it's this constant fire back and forth that just shred the top of the woods and shred the trees.
Yeah, I tried to describe to my brother the angle.
It's hard to comprehend.
Well, it's hard sometimes for me to comprehend. I'm a veteran.
Yeah.
You know, there's actually
The Union.
What happened there?
The Union officer came back here in '66. I said the one curious thing about out here was that all the trees were standing from the ground up to 4 feet, really untouched. 4 feet to 6 feet. The bark was peeled off. They were full of holes. It's almost like a certain level of men trying to kill the forest.
It's like, you know, you can probably see in the forest the line, you know, where they, like you said, if they were 4 feet or below, they probably weren't there during the battle. So they're just natural
It's a line of natural and just led to go back and forth.
yeah, I just showed him a picture of the one, that 22-inch oak that got, he didn't believe me, so I Googled it, and I was like, there it is.
I've seen it at the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
John, do you know what the distance is across there to the house?
To the Landrum house?
The distance?
I'm terrible at distances. It's probably a little over a quarter of a mile. It's probably a quarter of a mile.
What would constitute a killing field coming up through there?
Anybody who came out of the woods over there could be shot after them. Whether they hit them or not, it's up to debate. Depends on how good the accuracy of the guy holding the musket is. The real killing field, though, is coming up this slope.
Okay.
Because the Confederates had their works right here on the slope. The abattis, we read so much about, was actually about 10 to 15 feet outside of those works.
Okay.
So the idea was as they come up the slope, they get tangled in sabati, and it's a killing field right there in front.
Okay, so quarter of a mile all the way out.
Yeah.
And then 200 to 300
A good
yards.
man with a rifle musket could hit anything up to maybe 300 yards. That'd be a really extreme shot. Maybe a sharpshooter could hit somebody out there, but a lot of times I think just the excitement, shooting up in the air, throwing lead. What happened to Beth? Did you get everybody up here?
Back here behind you.
Break through the works. They hit actually the eastern side of the salient. Right in that direction is roughly due north. It's the western slope over here that's hit by Birney's division, David Bell Birney, followed by Gresham Mott. They're just slightly behind Barlow's attack. Barlow hits the works. Birney's no more maybe than 30 or 40 yards behind. As Birney's men come out of the works, it's the same thing. They overrun the skirmish line, capture the pickets and the skirmishers. They get down the valley and they start coming up this slope as fast as they can go. Rifles at the ready, uncapped, bayonets fixed. Mott's division comes out of the woods and seeing the men coming up the slope, they believe they're already in the work. They start to cheer. As a soldier in the Stonewall Brigade, which is right over here, about where the bloody angle is, I said they were so exhausted that night he was fast asleep, but it was that cheering that woke them up. As he stood up and looked, next thing you know, these black bodies literally rose out of the ground and poured over into the works and rolled in behind them and captured them all. That's what happened out here. It was Mott's cheering actually woke some of these men up. Up here in the line, though, majority of them were ready, raised their muskets up, the cap snapped, the rifles didn't discharge. The wetness that night, the rain had soaked through to the powder, the charges were no good, the rifles misfired. To actually get those things to fire, you'd have to fire your caps about 4 or 5 times. No one had that opportunity. There was a flurry of rifles, men flung their rifles like spears, literally trying to knock these Yankees down, but it was just this overwhelming flood of Union troops into the works. The artillery, Page's battalion, had just come back just in the nick of time. The men had come up, unlimbered the guns, were putting them into line. Only one gun, Lieutenant Carter's battery, right over here, got a shot off. And just before they could load their second shot, there were men at the chests of the gunners with bayonets, and the entire battery fell into their hands. All along the rest of the works, the batteries were captured, one by one. Those who tried to escape with the caissons, the men shot the horses down. The horse carcass is now added to the horror down there in the angle. What happened out here too, I only want to give you a real brief overview. The Medal of Honor was earned here on May 12th by a number of men of the 2nd Army Corps. And just in a couple of cases, Sergeant Charles Fall of the 26th Michigan, he was one of the first to mount the Confederate works where he bayoneted 2 of the enemy, captured a Confederate flag, and threw it away to continue the pursuit of the enemy. Took the flag, threw it away, and went after the rest of the enemy. Private George Harris of the 148th Pennsylvania captured a flag. He wrested it from the color bearer. He shot an officer who attempted to gain it. They cut that colors and hold it to him. He captured that flag and received the Medal of Honor. First Lieutenant Charles McNally of the 69th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. In the hand-to-hand encounter with the enemy, he captured a flag, was wounded in the act, but continued on duty until he received a second wound later that morning. And that's kind of misconceiving, because that later wound actually occurred later on after the fighting had been going on for about an hour or two. And Private Christopher Wilson of the 73rd New York took the flag from the wounded color bearer of his regiment, carried it in a charge over the Confederate works, in which the charge he also captured the colors of the 56th Virginia, bringing off both flags in safety. The majority of the Medals of Honor out here were given to men who captured flags, but there were others that, other instances that occurred here, that some quite humorous, some very tragic. Over on the east side, as Barlow's men are now rolling up this line, rolling up the salient, there's all these little personal duels that will occur. And one regiment, I think it was the 23rd Virginian, Stewart's Brigade, is a man they called Hickory Hat. You may have read this story in Gordon Ray's book. Hickory Hat was this big, tall, lanky Virginian. He gets arm in arm locked with this other Yankee soldier about as big as he is. The rifles are locked, and finally, after a little bit of frustration, he says, "Damn you, throw your musket down, and I'll wrestle you to the ground." And the Yankee agrees. Throws his rifle down, the two go at it, and they're wrestling just like this. And sure enough, Hickory Hat takes up the Yankee, throws him down, steps on him, and the starts to gouge his eyes with his thumbs. And naturally, the Yankee surrenders. I would too. I went and throw my rifle down. But as Hickory Hat stands up, next thing you know, he's got 3 or 4 other Yankees standing around him, comrades. So this poor fellow's on the ground with their bayonets in his chest. Hickory Hat winds up as a prisoner. Almost 3,800 men from Johnston's division wind up being crowded across this field as prisoners, and eventually they wind up in northern prison camps at Point Lookout. There are famous photographs taken near Quiet Creek. You may have seen these in those photographic history, and now they're available online, of this large group of Confederates gathered at a place they called the Punch Bowl on a Quiet Creek. Those are men of Johnston's division that were captured here May 12, 1864. And there they are. General Johnston himself, he is captured and taken back to meet Hancock. Along with him is one of his brigadier generals, a man named Maryland Stewart. And some of you may know this story, so if I'm repeating it, please forgive me. Stewart is this very strikingly handsome officer from Maryland. He starts the war as the colonel of the 1st Maryland Volunteer Infantry. By the time of Gettysburg, he's a brigade commander. In his brigade are Maryland, North Carolina, and Virginia troops. He's in a precarious position on the east side of the salient. On the left, he's attached to Witcher's Virginia Brigade, which is up here at the point. But on his right, there's nothing. There's a gap between he and General Lane's North Carolina Brigade, which is extending the works further down the Muleshoe. But Stewart is standing there with his men as the line rolls up before he knows it, he's surrounded. Colonel Beaver of the 148th Pennsylvania approaches him and demands his sword. And slyly Stewart says, well, y'all woke us up so early this morning, didn't have a chance to put it on. So Beaver then orders him to the rear with General Johnston. They go back to the Landrum House where Hancock has set up his headquarters. General Hancock sees him, extends his hand out and says, Stewart, I'm glad to see you. And Stewart says, I would not accept this hand under these circumstances. If it had been anything else, I would not accept your hand, a handshake. And Hancock said something to the effect of, I would not have offered it otherwise. I'm paraphrasing here, but basically Stewart refused the handshake of Hancock. Hancock says, I wouldn't have offered it otherwise. Go to the rear. General Johnston gets to ride to the rear in an ambulance. Stewart had to walk. What happens out here, though, after the 2nd Corps is thrown back here to the east angle, the line now is going to change because the 6th Corps comes in, hits the western face of the salient, and this is where the bloody angle is going to happen. This entire Muleshoe is not the bloody angle. That is the bloody angle. From about this point down the other side of the avenue to the road is where the troops will be in constant contact for the next 22 hours. 22 hours of continuous fighting. Men along the line, separated by earthwork 4 feet at the most in diameter, with troops on both sides shooting over their heads for 22 long hours. Men will die out here and never be heard or seen from again. The dead will get so thick that the living will step on them just to survive, to stay out of the water. There's so many horrific stories out here. There's just not enough time to tell you all of them. One of the more interesting stories is some of the men were more sly about this. They knew not to expose themselves. There's one soldier who was from New Jersey who got the idea. He found a little gap in the works. He would crawl up to the works, fire his rifle, crawl back down, load, crawl up, fire again. About the 4th or 5th time, this 8-foot Confederate jumped up from the other side, grabbed him, pulled him over by his coat collar, and made him prisoner. But unfortunately, most of the other stories do not have that kind of a happy ending. Yeah?
All right, so just a couple things. We've been talking a bit about how warfare is changing at large. We saw it at Upton's attack, a new sort of formation being utilized. To some degree, Hancock's men will utilize a similar formation. At least half of this attack is made in a very dense column. Of course, 20,000 men cannot punch through the lines as easily as 5,000. But you see the idea being applied and the principle, that point being driven home with the Army and being utilized here. The hand-to-hand combat that John described is the result. This new style of fighting has a cost, and it tends to be this kind of high-volume, brutal sort of fighting. That is the result at Upton's attack, and that is the result here. Except here, as John described, it really bogs down. But again, to touch on one of our other larger themes, and that is how these battlefields transform through time. So we think of them as battlefields, and we sort of try to freeze them in 1864, 1863, etc., and think this is how they're used. But even in the span of the days that these men are using these as battlefields, they change, they morph. So we can't look at this and say this is May 8th, this is May 9th, this is May 10th. We can see snapshots of it, but the entire battlefield has changed. And one of those elements we see here as sort of a lesser known story about the aftermath here at the Bloody Angle. John described the dead and wounded piled thickly in these trenches to the point that men are standing on top of them, are sitting on top of them. We even have one account of a man falling asleep on a dead man's thigh because it was where he was and he didn't have any other options. But the dead are piled so high in the trenches that it didn't seem to make sense to the burial crews after the battle to remove them. So we have several accounts of the trenches simply being pushed over on top of the dead. One man said the enemy had constructed a heavy line of works and thrown the bodies of our fallen braves in the bottom of earthworks. Well, for the most part, they probably were not thrown. This Virginian sounds a little bit indignant, but it's more likely that the burial crews simply said, these men are here, we're going to leave them as they lie. Theodore Lyman, one of Meade's staff officers, comes back through this area, and in April of 1866 he wrote about what he saw. He said, not only are the remains not collected in a common cemetery, but many marked graves have been overlooked. But, after all, the graves give little idea of the carnage here. Piles of men were thrown into the deep holes behind the entrenchments, built for cover by the enemy, and simply buried by digging down the parapet upon them. Another man wrote after the May 18th fighting that the soldiers had turned the breastworks over upon them for a covering. Thus they actually died in their graves. So it does lend to us a little bit of an explanation to the appearance of some of our very low works. They simply have not remained as they were immediately after the battle. Some of these works are kicked over or turned over on top of the dead to actually become their burial site. So I was asked by somebody earlier on in the tour, are there still men buried out here on the field? And the easy answer to that is yes. The burial crews came through after the battle and after the war actually and tried to pick up as many of the graves as they could find. But there's almost certainly graves out here that they missed, that they could not find. And what's more, one of my colleagues pointed out to me that when these burial crews come through to reinter these soldiers, to move the Union soldiers to the National Cemetery in Fredericksburg, the Confederate soldiers to the Spotsylvania Confederate Cemetery or the Fredericksburg City Cemetery, that what they are primarily collecting is bones. And so the majority of these soldiers, their remains are not necessarily bone. And so those remains still lie here on the battlefield. And realizing that some of these men probably still lie in the trenches. If they were already buried in the trenches and the men couldn't see, the burial crews couldn't see that they were there, they would not have removed them. So it does add a layer as we traipse across the battlefield today. Keep in mind that we always try to treat this ground as hallowed ground. Part of why we have certain policies in place is because we view these battlegrounds not only as a place to learn, but also as a place to show our respects, because there are certainly still a lot of soldiers out here on the field. But keep that in mind as we go along. John, do you have anything else?
No. All right. Question?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Just how the view from here down there, how like the way it is today was it then?
Okay, the question is how like is the view essentially that you see out here today to the way it was then? And I'd say it's pretty similar. We've done some scene restoration work here in particular to say that our tree lines are actually fairly accurate. So the openness that you see in front of the works was open. The woods you see behind the works were woods. I can't promise that the woods look exactly as the woods did, but there were definitely woods behind the works. There was open ground out in front. This is relatively similar to what you would have seen here in 1864. Yes, sir.
Yeah, not to get ahead of you, but
sure.
Lee's second line that he's working on until he can get it built. So right now it's way back in these woods, and is there physical evidence of it? Lee's second line?
So, and to some degree, the question is, what about Lee's second line? Because as the fighting is raging here, Robert E. Lee continues to send reinforcements into this position in order to stem the Union attack while he is building a line of works that entirely cuts off the Muleshoe salient. So if you're looking at your maps, again, which I know I've broken my promise and I've not oriented you at every point, we are about where So the route that we've traveled so far, if you look at the top of your maps, there's a thin black line that sort of juts out at the very top. That is Landrum Lane. That is where we came from back along the wood line. We've traveled across the field on a trail of our own making, so there is no real trail that you can follow across the wide open ground, but we have moved back toward the red line, the thicker red line, and we are about at the very tip of that salient. So we are right at the top of the bend in the red line, for everyone who's trying to see. That's where we are right now. Lee's last line that we're talking about, we refer to it as Lee's last line because it is the line that he is working toward withdrawing behind. That is the bottommost secondary line that cuts off the Confederate salients up here. His goal is to simply rid himself of this awful line. He's realized that this line is vulnerable and he does not want to continue to occupy it. At this point, it's almost impossible to dislodge the Federal soldiers. So, yes.
About this line.
So it is the bottommost red line that cuts off the salient right here. That is the line he is constructing. We will get to that later on in our tour. As long as we make good time, we'll talk a lot about that last line and its importance in the battle later on.
Could I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
My ancestor was here with Page's battery of artillery. He was in Montgomery's company of artillery, part of Carter's artillery, and I think they were back there. Is that sort of right? I mean, they were scurrying to go out of here, under these orders, and then they were scurrying to come back tomorrow,
Right. I think that Carter's men are some of the ones captured right as soon as they arrive on the scene.
Yeah.
My understanding is that they're back in this area. John, do you have a proper map?
I don't have the exact map of the battery here on the other side of the line.
Over where the cannons are? Okay.
Just beyond where the cannons are now.
Okay.
Carter's battery, Morse artillery, I think is on the left. I have to look at the rear half.
Now, doesn't part of Barlow's division, I think it was Brooks Brigade, weren't they like double quick from this area, like all the way around to somewhere else on the salient during the battle?
Some of Barlow's men were sent over to reinforce the 6th Corps.
That's what I thought. They were like
place them,
brought around.
But I don't know if I don't remember if they got into the line or not.
Yeah.
It's so fluid and everyone who's up at the angle is only there for maybe a half hour or maybe an hour.
Because you blow through your ammunition.
Because they're just moving. The guys who are there the whole day are McGowan's and Harris's Mississippians, McGowan's South Carolinians.
John, Beth, do we have any idea of when Lee realized he was not going to be able to retake this area and started the entrenchments along the last line? Noon?
I'd say pretty much immediately.
Almost immediately. He even said on May 9th, this is a wretched line. He said on May 9th, this is a wretched line. And they'd actually started some of the construction but abandoned it because they thought, well, most of the stuffing now is going on the Po River. He's trying to turn my left.
They're not going to frontal assault me. And
yeah, Lee actually has on the 10th, when Upton's attack is hitting, Battle's Alabamians are sent from the beginning construction of Lee's last line into the fight. So, but they don't really follow up on it. They don't continue to build it on the 10th, to my understanding, and they kind of take it up more actively almost immediately on the 12th.
And actually, you're saying about the burial crews later. It was one of the crews was a 5th U.S. veteran volunteer, and it was actually galvanized Confederate prisoners. They were brought here under an actually Charles Byrd.
I know we're pressed for time, but I want to give you a quick account. This is by Lewis Grant, who commanded the 1st Vermont Brigade, the 6th Army Corps afterwards. He said, "The slaughter of the enemy was terrible. The sight the next day was repulsive and sickening indeed. Behind the traverses and the pits and holes they had dug for protection, the rebel dead were found piled high upon each other. Some of the wounded were almost entirely buried by the dead bodies of their companions that had fallen upon them. Many of the dead were horribly mangled. The logs, trees, and brush exhibited unmistakable signs of fearful conflict." Norton Galloway, 95th Pennsylvania, was right up here at the angle for most of the morning. Momentary gleam of sunshine through the gloom of the sky seemed to add a new horror to the scene. Hundreds of Confederates, dead or dying, lay piled over one another in those pits. The fallen lay 3 or 4 deep in some places, and with but few exceptions, they were shot in and about the head. Arms, accoutrements, ammunition, cannon, shot and shell, and private belongings were scattered everywhere. And one other soldier also described the head logs that were on these works were shot, looked like broomsticks. or brooms. They were just shot into splinters. That's how much the intensity of the fire out here. Most of them averaged 400 rounds per man that day shooting.
So was the dead inside the angle, was that mostly Confederates, or were there some Union?
The Union dead were out here, the mix of Union dead, but the Confederate dead that were out here, McGowan's brigade, Harris's brigade, they're the ones, they're talking about the pits along this line here.
But I mean, even the ones that were in the hand-to-hand combat, you know, was there a mixture of soldiers from each side?
Yeah. Yeah, they simply pulled the Union dead out and reversed the works, put the works on the inside. So it's like Beth says, this isn't just a battleground, this is also a burial ground.
Well, if you all will follow us, we're going to head on down this path. It might be a long walk, so take a good drink of water if you're going to.